Hello. I've been having all kinds of trouble with my internet, but I'm hoping that I can make this video work. Probably the last video for the week. I just want to talk a little bit about social impact of the Industrial Revolution. Um, the Industrial Revolution, we talked about it starting in the 1700s, but you could easily talk about it going all the way through into the early 1900s with rapid invention. Sometimes it's called the Second Industrial Revolution after like the American Civil War with the telephone and light bulbs and things like that. But um, I want to take a look still at the early 1800s and some of this major impact socially. We've already talked a little bit about how hard it was for workers to transition from cottage industry where they're their own boss or they only work intermittently as like farm labor um, to working every day for someone else on a rigid schedule indoors. Those transitions were socially very, very difficult. And so I want to hit that again and talk a little bit more about the social impact. Okay, so first step of social impact is this: population growth. We had talked about how they're able to produce more food. Um, I want you to understand that a little bit of this is overlapping with some important um, improvements in medicine and understanding of diseases. Near the end of the 1800s, especially, guys like Louis Pasteur are going to be coming to real breakthrough moments, helping people understand medicine. So the population is growing because food is more available, because medicine is improving, and the Industrial Revolution is really kind of producing enough to sustain a larger population. So that's maybe step one. Another societal impact, though, is this urbanization. We mentioned this already, but I want to make sure you're understanding just how significant this is. Let me give you some statistics that will maybe sort of show the major shift. At the time of the American Revolutionary War, 9 out of 10 Americans lived outside of a city. Right, 90%. That's huge. It's a huge percentage. By the time you get to the end of the 1800s, that has almost flipped. Not entirely, but it was like where the majority were starting to live in cities. People who didn't have jobs in the farmland and rural areas of the United States were moving to the cities to find jobs. There are all kinds of jobs available: service industry jobs and entertainment jobs and retail jobs, factory jobs. The cities were where the jobs were. And urbanization was exploding. Cities going from being 100,000 people to being 1 million people. Chicago is maybe one of the most dramatic growth charts in terms of urbanization. And one of the reasons for this urbanization, aside from job availability, is what we might call mobilization. People start to move about the globe much more readily. Very famously, in the 1840s and 1850s, you have Irish and German immigrants, mostly maybe Irish in terms of the narrative. And there's millions, actually millions of people leaving Ireland to other places of the world. And many of them are doing so in desperation. They don't have any money at all. Their last dollars were spent to arrive in the United States. And this is true of immigrants into the 20th century. Places like Southern and Eastern Europe start to sort of mobilize in the late 1800s and into the 1900s. And a lot of times they're moving with their last dollar. And what's important about that is that means when they arrive in the United States, they have really no money to move much further into the United States. They have to stay in New York City or Baltimore or Boston or Philadelphia. Or maybe they have a job secured already and they go to Chicago. Or, there is the storyline where some of them are working in the mines of West Virginia or Wyoming. But a lot of the immigration was influencing mobilization as well. Sorry, urbanization as well. So the cities are exploding. What's also happening socially is there is a small movement towards what we might call an industrial middle class. And this is coming from a few different angles. One of them is middle management. Somebody might work really hard in the factory, might show initiative, aptitude, whatever, and they move up the ranks a little bit into middle management, and so they start to make a little bit more money. They are what we might call middle class. Other people are problem solvers, and they realize, oh, there's this inefficiency about our system. I bet if I fixed that, I could run with it on my own. And so inventors and various kinds of thinkers are actually working their way into an industrial middle class. But I want you to understand that's a pretty small group of people. We sometimes talk about the American rags to riches story, which isn't necessarily untrue. There are some people who are able to go from rags to riches in the United States, maybe the most famous of which is Andrew Carnegie, who was an immigrant himself and then became one of the richest men in world history. But I want you to understand how that's the minority story. That is the exception and not the rule. For the most part, people maintained their, stratification. They stayed put in their class. And it's not as though they weren't working hard. It's just that their opportunities were very, very limited. So what we have is an industrial working class. And this is the group of people who are poor and working in the factories, and for whom the transition to the Industrial Revolution is devastating, actually devastating to their to their quality of life. So you can see here listed several reasons why it's so devastating. One is these low wages. They were paid very, very little. Lots of court battles over minimum wage and things like that, because what was happening was these artisans and farmers, and they were being put out of business, and they didn't have any choice but to work in the factories, and then they were being paid very little. It's not like they could go somewhere else and get a better paying job. All the factories were paying almost nothing. It was really, really hard to provide for your family that way. The low wages were a real big sticking point. Another thing is they were really unsanitary. Even like the textile factories, you think, oh, this is cotton. How could it be so unsanitary? But the cotton fibers and all the disease was rampant in these factories, and so the people on the factory floors were in danger of getting sick and dying really young, actually. So they're unsanitary, unsafe as well. For instance, one of the things that factories often did was they would actually hire children, because children could fit into the small spaces between machinery, and they could, fix the thread if it got stuck or whatever else. And lots of people lost arms and fingers and hands. Workplace accidents contributed to a death toll that would shock us if we saw it up close and in person. And so the unsafe conditions were another real sticking point for the working class, who want to eventually kind of band together to do something about it. But maybe one of the most significant, and consistent storylines is the long hours. These workers were often working from maybe 12 hours a day to 15 or 16 hours a day, and they were working 6 days a week. Just incredibly long hours, and if they weren't willing to do it, they would simply be fired. And so their quality of life, even if they were healthy and even if they were, able to live long lives, they were working nonstop. No paid leave, no paid sickness days, no paid vacations, nothing. They had to work until they were dead, and they worked 6 days a week. Sometimes 6.5. They might get Sunday morning off for church. It was really devastating, impactful on faith communities, impactful on families as well. Let's talk a little bit about the impact on the family. There's varying ways that we could approach this. One is that the family is not as together. What I mean is, during the cottage industry days and artisan days, the family worked together. They worked the farm together. They worked their family business together, men and women alongside one another. What you end up with the factories is a really more rigid differentiation of labor. Men go off to work, and then women and children, maybe often, not always, stay home. especially in the middle class and above, you end up separating families. Now, the working class, maybe you don't see that as much because they all have to work to make ends meet. But once you get to the middle class, then it's like, okay, dad works and we never see him, and mom is home taking care of the kids, and that's how it goes. So that's one impact on the family. And this is something that sociologists would point out as being quite negative, actually. A second impact on the family is sort of a loss of childhood and a loss of like being raised in any real sense. Because even children in the lowest working class families who are really struggling to make ends meet, they were working all day, every day too. So there's no one really kind of pouring into them, raising them up. It's just, survive the day. And there's people, bossing them around at the factories, but not raising them. And parents had less impact on their children for that reason. Like, it's not every single person, but definitely there were really large groups of people who all of them had to work all the time. Now, there is a sort of asterisk to that. Here's the asterisk. Before, maybe we would say in the 1700s, having children was, of course, something people were excited to do and dreamed of, but also it was like a financial necessity. If you were, a small farm owner, you needed children so that they could help you work the farm, and that they had to be the ones that you could pass the farm down to. Like, it was actually a labor decision. You didn't have to pay children to work, so you had children so that they could work. So what ends up happening a little bit with the Industrial Revolution here is some sociologists will say, well, children now move to the center of the family because families are only having children if they really want children. It's not about labor anymore, it's about love. And so there is this sort of steady movement then over the last 150 years of children going to the center of the family. They go from the periphery where it's like, don't speak unless you're spoken to the very center where like your parents, my parents were like this, wrap their whole day around you. Like, got to get you to soccer practice, got to make sure you're at swim team, got to make sure that you have the food you want and the friends over that you want to have over. And we got to have that vacation to make your childhood really rich. And that is something that's rather new in history, where children have moved from the periphery to the very center of the story of the family. And some sociologists say that the Industrial Revolution is responsible for this. Last impact, and it looks like I'm going to have to talk about government a little bit later, pick it up some other place, but last impact is a slight one. It's a small one. Some people talk about how women are actually going to begin to have some options available to them during the Industrial Revolution that they didn't have otherwise, in particular with marriage. There are people like Robert Ludlow, who was a factory owner in Massachusetts, who basically hired women on purpose. The reason he hired women is not all that positive. He wanted people he didn't have to pay as much. But what would happen is women would move from their family's home into the dormitories and live and work in the city and in the factory. And he would promise their family, say, we're going to take care of them, we're going to make sure they don't get into trouble, that sort of thing. And they were working very, very long hours. But one of the things that some people point to is this idea that if they were able to make their own living, that meant they didn't have to get married. I want to say the impact of this is pretty small, but it's still something you can discern. You can see it. What we can see is the fact that there is a transition from marriage being about convenience or stability to being about love. You don't get married unless you love the person as you move into the 1900s, right? And so part of this is women have the ability to say, no, I don't want to marry that man. You have these, of course, novels that are dedicated to the topic, like Pride and Prejudice, the Jane Austen novels, that sort of thing, where you have these questions about why would you marry? Do you marry for stability or do you marry for love? And women who have choices now, if they're working for themselves, maybe they have the choice to say, I don't want to marry that person. I'm not in love with them. And so some sociologists do point to this possible positive impact of the Industrial Revolution on the family.